Hi, I'm Miss America. Welcome to my channel, America Teacher 5th grade, where we learn all things regarding 5th grade. Today we are studying the American Revolution, and I'm so excited for it. I decided to dress up, and we're just gonna go ahead and start. We are in lesson 2 of chapter, I don't know, 8 or 9. We're just moving right along. It's hard for me to keep track how far we've gone. So our timeline up here, this says 1750 and 1776. After the Declaration of Independence, we have the Battle of Trenton, and right after that, in 1777, the Battle of Saratoga. And I'm gonna test my memory, but I believe the Battle of Trenton was held like right around Christmas time, if not on Christmas Day, and that's when we won that. So imagine fighting in a war on Christmas Day. How miserable that would be. Unless of course you were winning, then it might be a big boost. I'm going to go ahead and share this picture right here, and then I'm going to scooch it up a little bit. Oh, let's go ahead and do the what to know first, and then I'll share the picture. All right, what to know. What were some of the important early events of the Revolutionary War? These are key things to know, and definitely these battles were part of that. Important vocabulary. Enlist, if we look over here, enlist means, it says many were farmers who had just enlisted, or, this is where we find out what it is, or signed up to fight. So if you enlist in the military, you are signing up to fight to defend our country. Okay. Number 2, mercenary. Let's look over here at the word mercenaries. So this says the British Army also used mercenaries or hired soldiers. So, and unfortunately, mercenaries did not show mercy, okay? These were hired people. They're like, I don't care which side I'm fighting for. I am being paid by these people, and so I will do. I don't know where they find them, but it seems like every movie that I watch with bad guys, there are basically mercenaries in that. They're like, yeah, you can pay me to beat people up. I'm like, oh my goodness. Here we go, campaign. And remember, we're going to be reading about this in context, but it's not a political campaign, it's a military campaign. Turning point, negotiations. So negotiations, we still definitely do that today all the time. Important people during this lesson is the Marquis de Lafayette. Here's a picture of him, Marquis de Lafayette. If it sounds French, it's because he is. We'll learn about him. He helped the Continental Army. If you remember, before Britain even started their colonies, they were constantly fighting with the French because the French had a whole bunch of land over in Europe, and England was stuck on this tiny little island, and they said, we want a bunch of that land that the French have. And so they were constantly fighting, and I believe his father died in one of the battles with Britain, and so he's like, I won't say he's out for revenge, but he is willing to forego all the money. He was a very rich young man. I don't know if he was still rich, but to be a marquis, that's a very high title. Like, that's close to being like next in line for like the King of France or something. Not quite the direct, but it's pretty darn close. So he has this great title. His family, I don't know if they were still wealthy, but once upon a time they were wealthy. He definitely has influential and rich friends over in France, but he was so distraught over losing his father, he decided to come. And what's really cool is when I went back east, and there were all these places, and they're like, the Marquis came back here, like, you know, he came back years after the Revolutionary War, and they still admired and respected him. There are streets, there are cities, there are buildings named after him because he was so loyal to George Washington and to the cause of the Continental Army and the American Revolution. Benedict Arnold, unfortunately, he was a great soldier. No matter what, he was a great soldier. Unfortunately, he was not loyal, and now his name is used in synonymously with traitor. So he allowed his soldiers on his watch to die. He really put George Washington's life in peril, and so he started off as a continental military leader. He was a leader, high-ranking one. Felt like he got overlooked for a promotion, and then said, well, if the Continental won't pay me, and they barely had money to pay anybody, so he went over and joined Britain's military. I don't know if anybody ever really trusted him after that. Eventually, he survived, and he eventually moved to England, but yeah. Another important person during this time is Friedrich Wilhelm von. I always kind of thought it was Frederick von William, but anyways, he was a great German leader. We will be learning more about him. I have a picture of me next to his statue, and he came at a very key time for the Continental soldiers. He really trained them how to be going from farmers to soldiers, and trained them well. And he was there at Winter's quarters during a very difficult time. Here we go. This is his full name. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Let's see if I can, I don't know. I guess I have to say it with some kind of a German accent. I don't know if that was a good one or not. Here we go. Places: Trenton, Saratoga, Valley Forge. That's, I don't know, to me that kind of feels like holy ground. When I went there, right now it's seriously just peaceful fields and forests. Cause and effect. There's the graphic organizer for that. Now we'll come over here where we are going to compare and contrast an American soldier and a British soldier. Let's just check out their hats. American soldiers had this tricorn hat, which was kind of a farmer's hat. If you let it down, if you didn't pin it up along the sides, it would just be a floppy farmer's hat. So they pinned it up so they could see better, maybe. The British wore these nice long hats, I guess. So maybe if you were aiming for their heads, you would miss and go up there, kept them warm. They had their own individual muskets. They had muskets with bayonets. Here they have a haversack for food. Notice, hopefully they had pockets that didn't have holes, and they would maybe put bread or something in that. They were always a little bit more prepared. Cartridge bag with sling, and definitely known by their red coats. Sometimes they wore blue, sometimes they wore brown. It's just basically whatever they had. Very few of them had matching uniforms, especially if you were a foot soldier. Perhaps like George Washington and the generals and the captains might have had uniforms, but weren't much. Supplies. British soldiers, right, often had better supplies than Continental soldiers left. What supply item did both types of soldiers carry? Definitely a musket. That's standard use for that. All right, I need to kind of get a drink, so I'm going to pause for a second. All right, let's go ahead and start with our "you are there." Remember numbers 1 and 2, you and yours, for second person point of view. You are there. The soldiers are starving, says the Marquis de Lafayette. They eat nothing but fire cake made of flour and water. Your stomach growls. Since Congress won't send help, General George Washington says, I'll order the local farmers to sell us their crops. So whether you wanted to or not, you were ordered to, but at least they were willing to purchase them. The air outside is cold, but you don't care. Let's go, you yell. We're finally going to get food. General George Washington, he did come from a well-to-do family, but how it was back then is that he had an older brother, and his older brother inherited almost all of the farm. So he didn't have it. He knew he had to, as a younger brother, George knew he had to make something of himself in the military. That's just kind of how it was back then, and that goes back to like the feudal system of England, where his brother was born, I believe, or at least had gone to. And then and he did marry Martha Washington. She was a widow. She was a young widow. She had 2 children. Her first husband, was much older, and he owned a lot of property, including the slaves that many people kind of looked down on George Washington from. He didn't have any of that. I suppose maybe he was raised with them when he was a kid, but he did marry into a family that had all of that. And then when he married Martha, I suppose he was in charge, but he did make it so that after Martha died, that all of their slaves were free. He really just wanted to go home and be a farmer. He's just like, I love the land. He loved all of that, but because he did love the land, that was also why he agreed to lead the army against Britain. Comparing armies. In July 1775, George Washington arrived in Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army. The soldiers had no uniforms, only their everyday clothes. Many had no guns, so they carried spears and axes. Some had fought in the French and Indian War, but most had no military training. Many were farmers who had just enlisted or signed up to fight. Washington was once so angry that he threw his hat on the ground and shouted, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" So remember, Washington was a trained soldier. So he knew what training was, and he's like, these people aren't it. And most of them didn't even really appreciate taking orders or learning about being a soldier. They just kind of, had that hot blood in them to go out and fight for their country. Keeping the army fed and clothed took a lot of supplies. Washington told Congress that his army needed 100,000 barrels of flour and 20 million pounds of meat a year. Congress could not raise enough money to pay for everything the army needed. A strong enemy. The Continental Army went to war against one of the most powerful armies in the world. The British... I'll read down to the bottom of this and then I'll move it. The British Army was made up of experienced soldiers. The British had about 50,000 soldiers in the colonies. Washington rarely had more than 15,000 soldiers in his army at any time, so they had more than 3 times as many. The British Army also used mercenaries or hired soldiers because many of the mercenaries came from a German region called Hesse-Kassel. Americans called them Hessians. So, and the Germans knew how to fight. Maybe they didn't have their war going on, but they're like, well, I know how to fight. And the same thing, these are often 2nd, 3rd, 4th sons who, they're not going to inherit their parents' property. And so being in the military was the only way that they could make a living for themselves. But the British had problems too. It was hard to fight a war 3,000 miles from home. Loyalists gave some aid, but the British soldiers still had to wait a long time for supplies and soldiers to replace them. Cause and effect. What caused problems for the British Army? Well, being over there and so there's a show out there called is it Poldark? And I would encourage you to watch it. It's pretty clean, and it starts off with him being in the British military, and then he goes off, and they kind of experience the same things. He was sort of a gentleman, but a poor gentleman, if you will, and so he really had to work his farm, and but he kind of understood why the Americans, and he's like, well, maybe we were on the wrong side of history, or at least the wrong side of fighting this war. And many young soldiers from the British Army, they were just like, they'd go over there and they see these people farming, and they're like, I want to farm. I left a farm. I'm not going to inherit that farm. There's no place for me to work except for perhaps in mines. And so they would try to leave the British military. If they got caught, then they were put before a firing squad and shot. That was it. Here we go. I'm going to move this back down. Or maybe while it's up, I'll look at this picture real quick. It says, an American victory. Native Americans helped the British at the Battle of Saratoga. This medal right shows the British surrendering. So here's the British surrendering. That's a medal. Perhaps that was something that all the soldiers received who fought in that battle. This is a classic, almost iconic picture of the American Revolution, and let's read this. It's a famous painting, Across the Delaware. This famous painting shows Patriot troops rowing across the Delaware River. It is unlikely that Washington would have been standing up. Yes, it is unlikely. Again, the artist took a little bit of freedom to show him standing in a very commanding form. And probably that person wasn't standing either, but they're just going off of their imaginations, and it does look very formidable. I'm sure he was sitting right there, and probably even may have had a robe, an oar in his hand as well to help push away all of that. Look at the floating ice in the river. Go, and they took hundreds of ships across. Early battles in the North. By the spring of 1776, Washington and his army had moved south from Massachusetts to New York. They were camped on Long Island when British troops attacked them. The Americans suffered great losses at the Battle of Long Island. The British Army then chased Washington and his army. Many American soldiers had left after the Battle of Long Island, and Washington had to ask the others to stay, and I'm going to say more like beg. He and the soldiers who stayed did their best not to get caught by the British. By winter, they had marched through New Jersey and on to Pennsylvania. British General William Howe and most of the British Army were still in New York. And again, many of them were leaving because they're like, you haven't paid me. And so he's like, I promise we'll pay you, And so he was really concerned about that, The Continental Congress wasn't helping him keep his troops. A surprise attack. By 1776, thousands of American soldiers were ready to give up. Washington came up with a plan to attack the Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. At this time in history, armies rarely fought battles in winter. Washington knew he could surprise the Hessians. On Christmas night, 1776, Patriot troops crossed the icy Delaware River in rowboats and marched 9 miles in Trenton. There they found the Hessian troops sleeping. They attacked, and the fighting lasted only an hour before the Hessians surrendered. The victory at Trenton gave American soldiers hope for the future. Cause and effect. What caused Washington to attack Trenton on Christmas night? So, you can probably simply answer that with there, but again, I'm going to give you a little bit more background into that because it was such an amazing one, and I encourage you to maybe study Washington's strategy. So Washington knew, again, as it said, they rarely fought during the winter. That was kind of their opportunity to regroup, train, drill, practice. it's no fun fighting in the snow, marching in, freezing weather. And that was just kind of how it was back then. And so they were following, all of these, oh, this is how it's been done for hundreds of years standards, instead of the Native American way. But Washington knew that many of his men, as it mentioned over here, they had just left. Technically, most of their enlistments were like from year to year, from January until the end of December. And Washington, after being beat, he's like, what do we have to offer these people to enlist? They aren't being paid. They're like, oh, you can forward my payment to my farm because my wife needs help. I've left my family, I've left my children, they're all struggling, and so they didn't want to stay and freeze to death. So Washington knew that he needed a win. That was the only way he was going to be able to convince people to re-enlist in January. He was going to lose thousands of men at the end of December, and so he was desperate. He needed to keep them. Again, he knew they wouldn't be expecting that, so he crossed it. He surrounds the fort where the Hessians were staying. Most of the Hessians, they're celebrating Christmas. They are not expecting an attack. They are drunk. They're like, this is how we celebrate, and this is how we stay warm in the winter and stay healthy. So, they were drunk. They weren't expecting it. It was an easy win. They surrendered very quickly. I don't even know if hardly any shots were fired. And that was a huge win. And so then many of the soldiers who had been demoralized a few months earlier, when they lost their battle here, said, yes, I am willing to stay with this man, re-enlist him. He is genius. And so, and I'm sure that they went in and took some of those bottles of whiskey or brandy or whatever, rum, whatever they were drinking, and celebrated themselves after that. So that was a huge win for Washington. He was a good strategist, and he was learning from the Native Americans and how to fight a battle strategically. An important victory. In 1777, the British Army planned a new campaign. A campaign is a series of military actions carried out for a certain goal. The goal was to separate the New England colonies from the other colonies. The British thought if they controlled all of New York, they could cut off communications and supplies to Massachusetts and the rest of New England. So remember way back in another one where they're like, hey, it may take 2 weeks or over 2 weeks to get news, depending on the weather. And so they said, hey, if we can stop this. They didn't have internet. They didn't have phones. All communications were either like on horseback, buggy, or maybe by ship. It says the British campaign called for many groups of soldiers to go to Albany, New York. There, they were supposed to join troops led by British General John Burgoyne, coming down from Canada. Together, they would attack the city from the north, south, and west. Oh my. This plan might have worked, but the British troops never reached Albany. They were slowed by battles along the way. Thank goodness. Many miracles. The Battle of Saratoga. On September 19th, 1777, Continental forces circled General Burgoyne's army near the town of Saratoga, New York. Burgoyne and his soldiers could not break through the American lines. The Battle of Saratoga was really 2 battles that took place over 3 weeks. During the second battle, the American general Benedict Arnold led a group of soldiers in a daring attack. On October 17th, Burgoyne surrendered to the American general Horatio Gates. The British loss at Saratoga was a turning point in the war. A turning point is an event that causes an important change. It looked as if the Americans might have a chance to win the war. So it certainly gave them great hope. Here we go. Just like the Battle of Trenton did and the win there, this again is very hopeful. Reading check. Cause and effect. What caused people to believe America could win the war? So again, I would say the battle at Saratoga. So now I want you to think of like maybe like a basketball game or something, since they're pretty fast paced, and you're like, oh my goodness, and like they go into like it's neck and neck or something, or like these two teams are really close and then they have their halftime, and when they come out, you know, you just kind of wonder, and then like near the end of third quarter, this somebody shoots like a 3-pointer, and then bam, and then somebody gets fouled and they make those 2 points, and now there's a 5-point lead, and now all of a sudden that team is much more galvanized, and the other team is a little bit demoralized, and that all affects what we think in our head. So if things aren't going well in your life, I want you to try really hard to think positive, and if you get a little win, you let that be a turning point in your life and say, I am going to go forward. Even if it's like, hey, good job, you passed your test. Even if it's not with an A, but you passed it, you didn't fail it. Let that be a turning point and go, I'm going to go forward, and I'm going to do amazing things in my life. Here we go. Winter at Valley Forge. In the fall of 1777, the Continental Army faced trouble. While trying to keep the British from taking Philadelphia, the Continental Army lost a battle at Brandywine, Pennsylvania. In September, British soldiers captured Philadelphia, where they got ready to spend the winter in comfort. Suffering through winter. This is one of the hardest times for this battle. So if you're going through a really, really hard time, all I can say is just do your very best to survive it and know that better times are coming ahead. Suffering through winter. The tired Continental soldiers moved to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington chose this place so that he could keep watch on the British. The Continental Army at Valley Forge was a ragged group. Congress did not have the money to send supplies. Most soldiers wore clothing brought from home, but it had been torn and burned from battle. Some of the men's shoes were falling apart. Many wrapped their feet in rags. To keep their spirits up, soldiers sang Yankee Doodle. Even though the song was written during the French and Indian War to make fun of the colonists, the Americans turned it around to make fun of the British. They're like, no, but we'll own it. And I think that's kind of the great American spirit. It's like somebody tries to put you down or something, you're like, nope, I'm gonna own it. Since food was also running low, Washington let his soldiers buy food from farmers with money from Congress. New York Governor George Clinton sent barrels of salted pork. Help from overseas. More help came from the 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, who traveled from France to join the Continental Army. Lafayette later said he had an American heart. Washington liked the young man and gave him important jobs. Lafayette spent his own money to buy warm clothes for the soldiers he led. He was so giving that they called him the soldier's friend. Life at Valley Forge also got better when Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived. Von Steuben was a German soldier who taught the American troops better ways to march and fight. He showed them how to work together and gave them confidence. By 1778, the Continental Army was much stronger. Reading check. Cause and effect. What effects did Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben have on the Continental Army? So he didn't clothe them, but he did, he gave them that confidence. And I guess that's why I'm here. I'm hoping that you can have confidence in what you know. And here's a picture of him. And notice his fine coat and all the embroidery work that's on it. Contributions from other nations. While the war raged on in North America, Benjamin Franklin was in France, negotiating with the French government. To negotiate is to try to reach an agreement among different people. Franklin asked the French for supplies and soldiers. He said that France would benefit from helping beat its old enemy, Britain. At first, the French offered only secret help, thinking that Britain would win. When news of the American victory at Saratoga reached France, the French agreed to help the Americans. So before they received help from France, and they were asking for it, they kind of had to help themselves. And again, that's also kind of the turning point. Maybe the crowd then starts cheering louder for you and supporting you. And, I'm not going to say that like the referees, they should stay there. But so sometimes those cheers from the others really helped. And we'll find out just how much the French did help them. Here's a picture. It says, Jorge Farragut was 21 years old when he came from Spain to fight for the Americans in 1776. He later became an officer in the United States Navy. So he was Spanish, and he's like, no, I want to join. Here we go. Guns, money, and food. In 1779, Spain declared war on Britain. Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, gave guns, food, and money to the Americans. Later, his troops captured many British forts. Jorge Farragut came from Spain to fight for the Americans. Other nations also helped. In 1781, the Netherlands gave a loan to Congress. Russian leaders tried to keep the British from blocking trade with the Americans. Oh, wow. So even Russia. So Britain in their, they had an amazing army, but they'd also made a lot of enemies. And so all these people came around to help, not just France, Spain. And remember the Spain, he was the governor in New Orleans, and even Russia. And I don't think I know, in all of these years, I know I've read this before, but it just never really stuck with me that the Netherlands gave a loan to Congress, so maybe they could finally start feeding their poor soldiers. Review, what to know. What were some of the important early events of the Revolutionary War? 2. Vocabulary. Use the word campaign in a sentence about the Revolutionary War. 3. History. Who led the American negotiations with France? Remember, it was that person who said, we must all hang together or surely we'll hang separately. 4. Critical thinking. Why was Valley Forge's location important to George Washington? And why would he want to be there? 5. Write a speech. Imagine that you are camped with the soldiers at Valley Forge. Write a speech to lift the soldiers' spirits. And maybe it could be a poem. Maybe it could be another song like Yankee Doodle. Maybe you could just come up with another verse. They had so many, hundreds of verses of Yankee Doodle. Congress could not supply all the troops. And so because Congress could not supply all the troops, what was the effect? 1, they lost soldiers. They lost soldiers to death, or they lost soldiers who ran away because they weren't being paid. The effect is Patriot soldiers at Valley Forge became skilled fighters. Oh, who helped them do that? Because who helped them? Okay, let's see. Let's learn about Bernardo de Galvez. That's him right there. Again, this is Jorge Farragut. So this is him. Looks older, a little bit more distinguished. His timeline, he was born in 1746. In 1777, he becomes governor of Spanish Louisiana. In 1781, Galvez captures the town of Pensacola, Florida. So Pensacola, Florida, I believe was, I suppose the British had a fort there. Why character counts? How did Galvez prove his trustworthiness to the Americans? He's like, well, these are my neighbors now, and I will support them, because if the British come through, they will probably try to take away our lands here. Unfortunately, yeah, I don't know, 50 to 100 years later, the colonists were like, yes, Texas, Spain, here we go, New Spain, we'll get trustworthiness, Bernardo de Galvez. We don't have a quote from him, which is too bad. Bernardo de Galvez was born in Malaga, Spain in 1746. Galvez first came to North America in 1762 with his uncle. 46, 56, 66, he would have been 20, so 16 years old, who was visiting New Spain. In 1776, remember, that's a key date, so all these things are happening in 1776. He returned to lead a Spanish regiment in Louisiana. 1 year later, Galvez became the governor of Spanish Louisiana. During the Revolutionary War, Galvez helped American forces. He protected New Orleans against British attack, gaining control of the Mississippi River. Galvez let Americans use the river to move weapons and food to Patriot forces fighting on the frontier. In 1779, Spain declared war on Britain. Galvez captured the British town of Baton Rouge. Oh, I didn't know Baton Rouge was British. It always sounded French to me. Natchez and Mobile. Oh, but remember the Britons in a treaty with France, they took over all of those places. In 1781, he captured Pensacola. By the time the war ended, Galvez and his army controlled all of West Florida and East Florida. After the war, the new United States Congress thanked Bernardo de Galvez for his help during the American Revolution. I know you want to be done, and I kind of want to be done. I'm losing my voice a little bit, but we're going to just go ahead and check out real quick Life on the Battlefield. Notice that all of these things, these are primary sources. So if you were to go to a museum and actually see one of these, that's what we would call a primary source. I suppose the college word would be, these are artifacts that help us to figure out how they were used. So, background. During the Revolutionary War, soldiers used many different items to help them during the fighting. They kept these materials with them at all times. Other items were important for the soldiers' comfort. DBQ, document-based questions. Study these primary sources and answer the questions. Shot mold. Shot molds were used to make bullets. Melted lead was poured into the mold. After the lead cooled, the shot was removed. One at a time? Oh my goodness. I'm pretty certain that maybe they started doing this, but can you imagine just making one of these at a time? Oh my. Leather wallet. Some soldiers used wallets to carry documents and personal letters. How would a wallet keep important items safe? Maybe it would protect paper from the elements. Those sorts of things. If you always know where it is. A brass buckle so it doesn't fall out. Little pockets inside it so that things don't again fall out easily. Number 2. How did a shot mold create a round bullet? Well, 2 halves together. And then I think there probably might be a little line around that, and then they would have to file it off to so it would be perfectly round. Why did soldiers need to make their own bullets? And so here's a thought, back then, some settlers had these lead plates, which is, useful and nice and everything, but they melted them down, and it was probably a good thing, because guess what? Lead plates eating too much lead can make you a little bit crazy. So there was a story once that tomatoes made you crazy, but what they learned was that the acid from the tomatoes would get into either lead crystal or lead plates, and then it would pick it up. So if they sopped up that acid and ingested that, then yeah, they were actually going a little bit crazy from the lead that they were eating. Powdered horn. So this is actual horn, either from I don't know, a goat, an elk. We'll see what else they could have used. Soldiers carried powder for their guns and powder horns. These containers were made from the horns of animals. Plugs kept the powder dry until soldiers needed it. So this would be like the removable plug. They would kind of finish it off here and they would pour it out there, so it'd be a little bit big. And they had a see-through horn to measure the powder. And I kind of remember like watching a movie once where the dad, a young teenage boy, wanted to join the Minutemen, and the dad was like, you need to know exactly how much. He's like, so first you measure it carefully, then you hold it in your hand and you feel it. And I'm holding my hand like out like this, but and you feel it. And so then you need to get used to that weight and know that that's exactly how much, because you're not going to have time during a battle to actually measure that. So they would get used to that, and then they would measure it out in their hand and pour it out there. How did soldiers remove the powder? Through that end right there. 5, why would soldiers need to keep powder horns near them? They just always needed to be ready. They were Minutemen, so as soon as they went home, before they went to bed, they would refill this back up with black powder and have it ready to go and have their shots ready to go. Why would soldiers need to keep powder horns near them? We just read that. Army uniforms. Some Continental Army soldiers wore uniforms made of heavy blue wool. And these were most of them. Let's see, it looks maybe a little green in the video, but in the book it's definitely blue. Why might it be difficult to fight in this uniform in hot weather? It's going to be super hot. You're going to be sweating. You're going to be miserable, but you don't want to lose it, because wool is great because it keeps you warm even when it gets wet. So if you have to like forge a creek or something like that, and then at night, maybe all you would have to sleep in is your wool coat. A wooden canteen. I've had a metal canteen. Never seen a wooden one. Canteens let soldiers carry water. A plug kept the water from spilling. Why would having water be important on the battlefield? Well, if you get hot, and even if you don't have time to eat, a swig of water is really refreshing. If you've ever played sports, you certainly know that, don't you? They passing around those water bottles right and left. And again, especially if you're wearing this heavy, hot coat, so you know whose side is on whose side. Underneath it, you would definitely want an undershirt, and it should be long sleeves, because wool is really scratchy and itchy. And you know, like I said, it keeps you warm, keeps you mostly dry. Go write about it. It says, what do these primary sources tell you about life on the battlefield? Write a paragraph that describes the daily life of a Continental Army soldier. All right, so these are things, and most of them were responsible for their own. You know, they just didn't have somebody go, oh, these are your rations, these are how many bullets you get. You had to make your own bullets. You had to be prepared yourself, those sorts of things. And so, again, women would melt down their pewter plates and those sorts of things. Anyways, we are almost at 45 minutes. That is the very last of it. Thank you so much. Took you quite a bit of time. So super job on improving your self-discipline, your self-reliance, your self-respect, and respect for others. Hopefully you can have a little bit of respect for these people who fought in very difficult circumstances for the freedoms that we can enjoy. And just let you know, freedom is not a one-time thing. We always need to appreciate it. Sometimes I think people appreciate their freedoms too much without appreciating all the sacrifices that were made to get them to where they are. And if we have any problems in our country, I feel like it comes kind of from ingratitude to the people, by just because we don't know them. We might just be ignorant. So I hope you appreciate all that they have done for you, and know that I do think that you are a fabulous individual, and I know you're going to go on to do great things for this great country. Even if you live in another country and you're studying our country, I know you're going to do great things. Have a great day.